Photography Daily.
The reason I record was I love radio. I mean, the whole take a picture, tell a story business is always, I've always told people, it's radio with a photo. It is not a photo with audio.
Take a picture, tell a story. American photojournalist Robert Gumpert's 13-and-a-half-year project today in county jails, where he makes a portrait, then sits down with each person and records the sound of them talking of their experience, as he says, radio with a photograph.
It's open to everybody in the jail, meaning everybody, the deputies, operating staff, everybody who wants to do it. And they will sit and talk. They'll get a copy of the story they tell, and they'll get a copy of prints.
Robert talks about what he calls the exchange.
This was an exchange between the subject and myself. And it was quickly becoming just the prisoners, primarily because nobody else would take part.
We hear clips from those he's talked with.
I did everything she told me not to do. And that's one of the reasons why I ended up in prison, because I didn't listen.
I'm not used to being in a 12-man tank. I prefer to have just one cellmate, and if you get along with them, time will go that much faster.
I am definitely in and out of jail, nonstop. I can't do this anymore. I just want my family back. I want my daughter. I'm over this. I'm getting too old, and this just isn't cute anymore.
Going into a jail environment to make photo stories could, of course, be a trail of paperwork, red tape, a very turbulent, bureaucratic experience even, though it turns out Robert was able to write the rules.
The rules were I talked to people without any supervision, and the department could not listen to it.
Robert talks about how his presence with this project impacted on those inside.
Folks began to see the interview room as a safe place, a place they could go, be whoever they wanted to be, say whatever they wanted, and they weren't going to be judged.
He talks about being the listener without a microphone and the photographer without a picture.
Sometimes they weren't particularly interested in having a photo taken or being recorded. They just wanted to sit. And we would sit.
13-and-a-half years in county jails. How did it impact the photographer?
It certainly made me more outgoing, I guess, more able to walk up to people. I've always been essentially a shy person. That was always both a drawback and a difficulty for me in this business.
Stories of life told by photographers, and today that photographer is Robert Gumpert.
The things that did startle me were I knew intellectually how bad life could be in some areas, but hearing it is different.
Patron of the day today is Nick Norris, the Bokeh Bard. I will link to his Instagram, which is at Bokeh Bard, Bokehbard. And where do I start? Well, the grids are a real collection of literal blood, sweat and grit in places. But your website bio probably says it best, Nick. Bokeh Bard is an alliterated theme and body of work created by professional photographer Nick Norris. Based in Northeast Florida, Nick specialises in crafting a story through documentation and vivid inspiration. The goal is to evoke emotion and reveal a hidden secret in the people he photographs. And you do that, Nick, in bucket loads. Insta is a great place to find some creatives who aren't afraid to experiment, to go with the flow, the anti-cookie cutter experience. And there's a picture which I will link to today that really, really drew me in. It's of a well-worn, well-weathered hand on a counter with a small transistor radio just in front of him. I wanted to know who he was or what the story was about, so I read the description, and it said this: I'd see him bundled in layers while riding my bike around town. A few times a week, this man would come to the donut shop where I worked and order the same thing each time. One plain donut and a small coffee. His beard and wild hair were a ragged lion's mane, and despite his looks, he'd sometimes have a random woman with him and buy her a coffee too. You can read the rest from the link. Nick is one of our Patreon patrons, helping to build and keep this podcast alive. All patrons get to hear the extra Tuesday and Thursday Diary Come Thoughts shows. And tomorrow the thoughts turn to what happens when you're not feeling so creative, when the photographs around you or the places around you seem too familiar to make you feel even remotely creative. And we're also supported by mpb.com, still the number one platform when it comes to trust for buying and selling and trading used camera gear. with offices and warehouses now in Brighton, UK, Brooklyn, USA, and now Berlin for Europe. The founder, Matt Barker, knew he could improve the speed, the reliability, and experience of trading kit online, and so with his company created an easy-to-understand online sales site. And it is easy. Look, I can use it. He employed product experts at base and people who really care about the photographers and customer service. Over 250,000 creatives in the UK, Europe and the US trust mpb.com for, well, I'm going to say our kit needs. Right, to my guest today. I was introduced to this photographer a good few months back, and I'm so glad that kindly nudge occurred because I've spent hours devouring his work online, and in particular, Take a Picture, Tell a Story. I've already introduced you, of course, to the story in the introduction, and you've gathered that today introduces the concept of recording sound to add a further layer to your story making or storytelling. But why not use video, I hear you ask? Well, that's answered in the piece you're about to hear. This idea of looking into a portrait sitter's eyes whilst you hear the sounds of what they're saying, the stories that they're telling, I think it's truly powerful because you're not being fed straight to the answers glossary. You're actually being challenged to make the pictures move for yourself by the sounds that you hear. I know some will doubtless disagree still and simply repeat the question about video, but minus the photographs, as you listen, unless of course you click through to the show notes, programmed to open in a new window if you're using a podcast app, minus the pictures, as you hear those in jail speak in this episode, I want you to truly engage, to imagine the room they're sat in, where Robert is, where they are. Maybe they're sat cross-legged, easy in posture, or somehow maybe they're more alert. What do they look like? What's their demeanour? An old radio saying goes, and I think it goes back to before the commercial department used it to sell airtime. This goes back to drama, I'm sure, and probably even Orson Welles' War of the Worlds. The saying is, radio paints better pictures. And for photographers looking for a project, a portrait project in particular, I hope this is going to energise and enthuse your desire to start working on it. This is Robert Gumpert. Take a picture, tell a story. Robert, this is frankly an extraordinary piece of documentary making. Take a picture, tell a story, an interplay between words and photographs. They're powerful enough as pieces on their own, but as you say, together they can be far more than the sum of their parts. But before we talk about that particular story, I want to rewind a good few years prior. Go back to 1974, when you went to cover a coal miners' strike in Kentucky, because that involved audio as well. Tell me about it.
Oh, it's a long story, but it involves two parts. One part is that in 72, I hitchhiked across the United States. And at some point on the way back, I found myself outside on the road running near Cabin Creek, West Virginia. And as I sat there on the road waiting for a ride, you could see the miners going home in their cars, completely black, because at that point, the mines didn't really provide showers.
No.
Or cleaning facilities. And I thought to myself, I have to come back here, primarily because I come out of a labor family. So 2 years later, I had been sitting on a small sum of money, a workman's compensation settlement. And I liked to have thought of myself as a photographer, but I really wasn't. And I'm looking around for something to do. And I talked to a lawyer from the National Lawyers Guild about some work I had done, a 2-day trip I'd done to take photos of farm workers. So I was in his office and he said, I have to take this call, go wait outside. So I waited outside and there was a paper and it said, summer programs for law interns in West Virginia with the Black Lung Association, which was sort of like an NGO. It was an advocates group.
Right. Black Lung Association.
Yeah. So the black lung is what coal miners get. It's what they get from breathing too much coal dust. It's sort of like emphysema or silicosis or asbestosis or brown lung, which is for textile.
Yeah.
So I thought, oh, hell, this is where I want to go. I've been waiting for 2 years. So when we got back in, I said, look, do you think they'd take me as a photographer? I have zero law training, but hey, so he said, I have no idea. Let's call them. And he called them right there on the spot. And they said, we can't pay anything. If he wants to come out, we'll find something for him to do.
Yeah.
And so I went out. I spent 3 months. I went first to Charleston, West Virginia, and I was at a big rally. And this guy came up to me and said, you need to go to Harlan County tonight because all hell is going to break loose tomorrow. So I said, fine, let's get in the car. Let's go.
And that's how you ended up at this big strike.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I hadn't known about the strike when I went down. I just wanted to work with the Black Lung Association and get my ass back to West Virginia with these coal miners.
I know whilst you were covering the miners' stories, the first early foray, if you like, into making photo stories and photojournalism, you did start to record audio of the people you met with limited success at that time, yes, but it was the spark, wasn't it, really, that would return for the story we're going to talk about in Take a Picture, Tell a Story. But I'm intrigued why the audio became pivotal to your storytelling, Robert, and portrait making. Why sound? What was it?
The reason I record was I love radio. I mean, the whole take a picture, tell a story business is I've always told people, it's radio with a photo. It is not a photo with audio.
I mean, I share your fascination for audio, obviously, but I wondered why you had done it that way instead of simply filming or videotaping.
Because video is cold. Video is a deliverer of everything to you.
Yeah.
Here's the guy talking, here's the sound, and you can sit back in your chair and you listen and you watch the video and all your senses are occupied. And you don't think. You don't think, you don't imagine. And so for me, that when you read, you're filling in all the blanks that the author left for you.
Yeah.
Not because the author was shoddy, but because they left spaces for you to fill in.
Yeah.
If they're really good, that's what keeps you going.
Well,
and with radio stories, it's the same thing. You fill in.
And you're right about the books. I remember reading Harry Potter to our eldest a good few years ago now. And when he saw the film eventually, he said, I didn't think they would sound like that. Because you do create your version, don't you?
Yeah.
And that great phrase of used in radio all the time, which I remember, which is always, radio paints better pictures.
Absolutely. It's like watching a baseball or a cricket game. A good announcer. If you have the video of the cricket game, it's going to be boring. It's a long game. Not much happens. But if you turn the video off and just listen to a really good commentator, it's great. And the same is true, auto racing or baseball.
So let's leap to 1996. We've missed out, I know, a huge part of you forming a career and becoming a photographer. But I do want to talk about this fascinating project. But before Take a Picture, Tell a Story, there was Lost Promise, which started to introduce you to the criminal justice system photographically. Tell me more about that.
Well, up until 94, I guess, I had been a foreign correspondent for about 7 years. So in 94, I decided that I needed to spend more time with our son, who was at that point about 7. But it was also a matter of money. I mean, traveling is expensive. So I knew I was going to have to stay home. I knew that staying home meant that I was going to work probably mostly on portraits because personalities is all anybody wanted. They wanted headshots. They weren't going to hire me to do stories. And I thought, I want to do a piece about homicide detectives, that is, looking at the real life of a homicide detective versus the Hollywood mythical version. And a friend who had just become an editor at an alternative paper asked me, what would you like to do? I said, I'd like to do this. He said, I can't pay you, but I think I can get you in, and then we can do something with it. And he did get me in, and himself. And then he was fired, and I went to these 2 homicide detectives that we had talked to, and I said, my friend has been fired. There's going to be no story. However, I would like to stick around because his idea was always a very classical one. The murder is the central hub of a wheel and all these spokes go out. And so the murder touches all these people. And that was the story he wanted to do, but that wasn't the story I wanted to do. I wanted to do, what is your work like?
Yeah.
So they said, yeah, you're welcome to hang around. So I hung around for a year. And all that time I was trying to get into the jail and nobody was helping. And the jail is difficult, to say the least.
Yeah.
And so suddenly I remembered that one of the homicide detectives had said, I know somebody who's good friends with the sheriff. So that's the elected head of the sheriff's department, which controls the jails here in the States, who knows that person well. I can call him and he'll recommend you. And I can't tell you, I mean, all your listeners are going to recognize this. People tell you they'll help all the time, and they don't.
No.
And so I thought, Tony, will you do this? And I went to see him, and he said, sure. And a half an hour later, I had walked home, and I was home, and there was a message on my answering machine from this guy saying, here's the person you need to talk to. Here's her number. She's expecting your call. I made an appointment. I showed her the work. She got up, she showed it to the sheriff, and I was in.
So this tenacity that you had for making pictures in jail took you to a project called Lost Promise, which is a whole other interesting story where across 2 years, 94 to 96, you attempt to unpick the criminal justice system in thoughts, words and pictures, which we will link to. Very strong photojournalism. You did a handful of other projects, but I know you were keen to make a jail-focused project, and that happens quite by chance, doesn't it? Tell me what happened.
One day I got a call from the aforementioned chief of staff, and she said, we're closing the state's oldest county jail.
Yeah.
It was 72 years old. It was an interesting place, to say the least. And do you want to document the last 3 months? And I laughed at her because they had said they'd been closing it for 5 years.
Yeah.
And she said, no, we have a date. It's happening. We're doing it. Do you want to do it? And I said, yeah, I'll do it. And for the last 3 months, I did Friday, Saturday, Sunday shifts on the swing shift. So 3 days a week, 8 hours a day. And I would go in and give them my driver's license, and they would give me a set of keys.
They give you a set of keys, right? Okay.
And I finished.
Yeah.
And there was an exhibit. And I went to the sheriff and I said, we're done. I'm done. And he said, great. And I said, but I have this other project I would like to do. And he said, what is it this time? And I said, I'd like to do it. People like to talk to me. I'd like to do a project called Take a Picture, Tell a Story. It's open to everybody in the jail, meaning everybody, the deputies, operating staff, everybody who wants to do it. And they will sit and talk. They'll get a copy of the story they tell, and they'll get a copy of prints. And he says, well, that sounds very interesting. How often and where do you want to do it? And I said, I want to do it for as long as I want, anywhere I want. And he looked at me and said, I need to think about it. Yeah, I said, I'll call you tomorrow if that's how long it takes. He said, oh, that's fine. I called him and he said, fine. So I thought it would last a year. Then it lasted 2 years. Then it lasted 3 years. And after 3 years, the whole thing kind of changed. Originally, it was going to be some sort of document, I don't know what, but, an exhibit but it was for, we take pictures or we tell stories of the people in front of us, and then we turn around and we give it to people behind us, the consumer of it. And that was the idea. And after 3 years, it became pretty apparent to me that that was not the idea anymore. The idea was this was an exchange between the subject and myself. And it was quickly becoming just the prisoners, primarily because nobody else would take part.
Well, let's talk about a couple of the stories. Front page of the site, we met with the topless Michael Polo.
My first time coming to jail, it's been stressful. It's nothing like you would ever imagine coming here. It's a mental game. It fucks with your mind, and you have to stay strong. Coming here is just the worst experience of my whole life. It's been total hell for me and my family. Been here just waiting, playing the waiting game. It feels like forever, even though it's only been 17 months. The hardest thing about being in a jail is getting a visit from my mom and seeing her and hearing her cry on the phone and at the visits and just seeing how much pain I'm putting my family through.
Did the authorities ask that you present inmates in any way? Because Michael was pretty expressive. Were they concerned about how you would portray folk?
I think the folks were more concerned about how I would portray them than the deputies, and certainly the sheriff. The sheriff had by this time long since trusted me. He had no interest in somebody coming in and telling the stories that people expected to hear. There's a fight every minute. We have lots of drugs. He was more interested in people being able to talk about who they were and what their concerns and in life were, and what their hopes and dreams were.
Yeah, I know he was on your side very much, but some of the establishment weren't, were they?
The deputies did not like what I was doing. There were always some that got much worse as time went by, and the type of people that became deputies in the San Francisco Police Department began to change more and more. But the rules were, I talked to people without any supervision, and the department could not listen to it. Eventually, they did two things. They demanded that all photos that were handed back to the prisoners had to first be passed, sanctioned by the watch commander, and that I could no longer give prisoners a CD of their story, which went in their property. They obviously couldn't have it there because a CD can be made into a weapon. So this is in 2011. So that's early on. About halfway through the time I spent, I guess. So at that point, the deputies were fine. I could take people where I wanted. The people in the pod, which is what this was in. This is in the newer jail. I always asked people, and like taking the pictures here, it was done in the gym, which is why he could have his shirt off. And I would check to make sure that if there was a game going on, everybody was cool with me doing this. So we had there was always this, you want to make sure, if you treat everybody with respect, get all the rules, whatever they happen to be, up front with folks, then there was never any problem. It wasn't like I was getting into people's face. They would actually play the game and make sure they didn't get in my way. So it all worked out. And then we would go into an interview room that's part of the pod, and we would sit down, and there were some logistic things about rights and not rights and what happened with the photos. And then I would just say, tell me your story. They would tell me whatever they wanted to tell me.
So in county jail, they're waiting for trial, and many of those you spoke to couldn't afford bail. They'd be in there for a great proportion of the 3 years they could be in there at the time of project, at any rate. And they shared their journeys very openly with you, Robert, such as Jennifer Gaines here.
I'm going to tell you the story of how I ended up here. Well, I've always been a drinker, and about 10 years ago, I had quit drinking, and for quite a long time, about 15 years, I didn't drink or do drugs or anything. And I had a baby, and I was, about a month later, I was in the car with, my husband had picked me up and from a friend's, and he didn't have the car seat in the car. And so he picked me up, and we were driving home, and we had a car accident. And I had my baby on my lap, and she went through the window of the car, the windshield, and she saved my life. And I've just never been the same since then. And I've not had one sober day since that happened. And I don't even know how to live anymore. And so when I get out of here this time, I don't know what I'm going to do or what's going to happen to me.
Jennifer Gaines exchanging some very personal thoughts with you, Robert. We talk often about the catharsis of photography on this show, for us as the photographer or photographers, but it appears in many of your recordings that you were, if you will, in some form, part of their release mentally. Not counselling, perhaps, but certainly a conduit. Would you say?
I can't answer that because I'm the one sitting there just listening. I do know from feedback I got from people, from the prisoners and a couple of deputies, that folks began to see the interview room as a safe place, a place they could go, be whoever they wanted to be, say whatever they wanted, and they weren't going to be judged. The thing about folks, as you probably have heard from a lot of pieces, the thing about folks in their situation is, especially if they are at all related to gangs, safety on the street is in part up to how you look. If you look basically like, do not fuck with me, people don't fuck with you. But it's hard, I mean, it's hard to maintain that all the time. But it's something you have to maintain all the time in the jail because you're living in a dorm with 17 other people, many of whom have grudges, many of whom have bad days. The deputies have bad days, and that plays out.
Yeah.
And then you have the other part of this, which is that you get to know people's weak spots. And the deputies use those weak spots. Other prisoners use those weak spots. And so people came into the room if they had gotten called, and I had a list. And if their turn came up and they came in, they would sit down, and sometimes they weren't particularly interested in having a photo taken or being recorded. They just wanted to sit, and we would sit. The deputies certainly did not understand what I was doing, and they didn't particularly like it often. It was coddling these folks. That would be in quotes.
Yeah.
And so they just left me alone. And a couple of times people would say, this has been the greatest thing. You pulled me out at the right moment because I was going to end up in the hole.
Wow.
Somebody would come back from court and they did not get the result they had hoped for, whether that would be acquittal or a sentence. And when they came back, they would talk.
Of course, not all those conversations would be desperate if the court ruling even had gone the wrong way. There are very palpable moments, Robert, where you also have recorded hope. I mean, you close your eyes and you can hear it certainly in Dehesi Rourke's voice when he spoke with you.
Oh, wow. It was, I cried, but it was beautiful because when I got released, I was in Lancaster State Prison. When I got released, it started snowing on the day that I left, so it was so beautiful. And it was breathtaking. I swear I kissed the ground because it was 11 years straight that I have not seen or just been free to walk on my own or put on my own clothes or just to smell the real fresh air or freedom or even just get in a car and drive away. Like I said, my wife came to get me. She ran and jumped in my arms. And I was, like I said, we both cried, but it was a wonderful feeling. It felt good to be free.
Dehesi Rourke, the breadth of stories, the people we meet through you and this Take a Picture, Tell a Story project are extraordinary. From prison politics to tattoos to respect matters of sex, homelessness, transgender violence, the SHU, which a few of those you talked to reference, the security housing unit designed to isolate inmates from any form of human contact, which Armando Carlos and Larry Adoin describe here.
I spent 10 years in the Pelican Bay SHU. I got out, and I was under the impression that, I'd be able to break the bad habits that I had because I had other ideals when I was out there. But, I got distracted and things happened. And when I came back in here, I realized that even though I tried to eradicate the habits you acquire being in Pelican Bay SHU, they ended up staying with me.
It was hard at first being in there by myself. It's like being isolated. Nobody be talking on a tier. You really have to be a strong individual because if you're weak, you'll break down, basically. Unfortunately, it's been times where, if I didn't have my faith in God, and family, I don't know where I would be.
Larry Adoin, it appears to me you never really asked, it wasn't part of the project to ask what they'd done. Larry, for example, had been in prison all of his adult life. And he does explain, actually, why he had been. But many of those you talked to don't really share that story. Did you ask?
No.
No.
I never asked.
Isn't that interesting?
I didn't really care. I mean, after I would do somebody, some of a deputy may come up and say, that's a really awful person. Some folks did some pretty horrible things. And I'm glad that I didn't know.
I would imagine there must have been times where you did find out what they did, and I wonder whether, Robert, it changed you at all. During this period of these 13 years, it must have left an impression upon you.
It certainly made me more outgoing, I guess.
Right.
More able to walk up to people. I've always been essentially a shy person. That was always both a drawback and a difficulty for me in this business.
Yeah.
It broadened my perspectives. I've always thought that people within a very broad parameter, we all have the same hopes and desires, and we don't have the same constraints. We don't have the same pressures, but the hopes and the desires, and we want a decent life. We want to be left the fuck alone. Want the best for our kids. All that was kind of confirmed. I think that the things that did startle me were I knew intellectually how bad life could be in some areas, but hearing it is different.
Well, let's hear from Melissa Perner this time, talking about the subject of drugs, which we'll come back to in a moment, I think, with one of your, if you will, most memorable stories that you heard. Melissa.
The needle's like the last frontier, I guess, because I don't know, once you get there, like, you're not going to be able to go back. Like I have bad veins and I'm hard to hit, and they're really deep, and sometimes they hide and stuff. So I've spent like hours trying to hit or whatever, and people were like, why don't you just snort it? Why don't you just whatever? And I'm like, no, like, you don't know. So it's fucked up, but it's also the most sanitary way to do drugs. Like, it actually does less, like, if you use a clean needle every time, it does less damage than smoking or anything for your body. So that's my excuse.
Melissa Perner. And it was a story about drugs, Robert, told to you by one of the men you met and photographed and recorded inside that I know is one of your more memorable ones. Why?
Because I asked him at some point, I just simply said, what do you do for a living? He says, I'm a corner guy, meaning he sells drugs on the corner.
Right.
And he was like 50. And I said, oh, okay. And he said, I'm a really good corner guy. I'm in demand. And I said, why? And he said, because I have great customer relations. My customers love me. I give value for money. They know the product's good. I show up on time. I'm clean. My site is clean. I pay attention to what they want. And I have good, and then on the other side of it, to my suppliers, I keep excellent records. I'm never short. I tell them if I need more, I tell them how much more I need. And they know it's true. If they need to cut back for whatever reasons, they know I'm telling them the truth. So he said, I can go to any of the supplier and say, hey, I'd like to take this. I have a corner. Can you give me some stuff? And they will all do it. He said, because I'm a good corner guy and my reputation is good. And I said, you are like the perfect employee. Why can't you get a job? And he said, nobody in my neighborhood is hiring. There are no for hire signs in my neighborhood. So this is what I do.
Why did it end? Because after these 13 or so years, it comes to an end. And I know you didn't want it to end.
It came to an end because the sheriff that let me in left in 2012. And then there was a new sheriff. And he was different, but he was still a progressive. And I was a harmless guy. I didn't cause any trouble. So he let me in. He just renewed it. But as I've said before, the makeup of the workforce, the deputies, had systematically changed over the years to a much more law and order kind of, we need to lock people up attitude. And I was not trusted. I mean, it's pure and simple. I was giving all these terrible people something for nothing without anything, they did not see, for me, this was an exchange. I gave you photos because you gave me stories. I thought this was a tremendous deal, but that's not how they saw it. They saw it as I was giving these people who had not earned the right, this free perk. And I was doing it without requiring of them anything. So they didn't have to be better citizens of the jail to get on my list. They just have to have, as I walked down the line handing out photos, they just have to have gotten my ear so I could write them in the book. That's, so they didn't like that. They saw me as a loose cannon. What is he really doing? They, giving him prints. Now what's going to happen? They're passing secret signs through the photos. which deputies came up to me and said. So it became increasingly difficult, and I had to increasingly find workaround. So eventually the workaround was, I won't give people the audio, and if they want it, I'll email it to them or a loved one. And in the photos, I won't hand photos out until the watch commander views them. And the reason for that is that you can't have pictures of gang signs. But when I was giving the photos out, there would always be a deputy who would say, oh, that's a gang sign. And they would take the photos and rip them up. And then they would tell their superior that, oh, I got these photos of a gang sign. And I would get into trouble. But what was happening is the deputy would be either unclear of what the gang sign was and was unwilling to take the chance that they had done a search, found a gang sign, and hadn't confiscated it, or they were just screwing with the prisoner and took it because they could. So the idea was, I knew that, this is a uniform force, so that if I could get the chain of command, the top of the chain of command, to sign the photo that it was okay, then it didn't matter what the deputies thought of it. They wouldn't take it for having gang signs. But the rules kept getting a little tougher and a little tougher. And eventually it came that I had to report to an officer and say, I'm going into this jail at this time this week. And I had to do that every week. And that worked out fine. Pain in the ass for me, pain in the ass for them, but it worked out fine. And then that officer got changed. Somebody else was rotated in. And that was somebody that absolutely hated me. And so I called up, because I didn't know he was there. I called up and I said, I'd like to go in. And this is the day, this is the time. And the next thing I know, I get an email from the sheriff saying, you have violated the rules and you're gone.
That was it.
And then the sheriff retired. And the new one wouldn't answer all my questions, wouldn't answer any of my attempts to make contact.
Well, with the story now at an end, I mean, who knows, maybe not for all time, but for the moment, yes, I suppose the focus could turn on those, finally, that you've photographed who may be outside rather than inside now. Have you heard from any who told you their story? Do they personally contact you?
Yes, occasionally people do, or relatives. I've had a number of relatives contact me, or friends contact me that the person died, and they would like copies. Could I do that? There was one guy, his half-sister emailed me and said, he's the black sheep of the family. He's been in trouble his whole life. He's now back in prison, which I knew. And he, when I asked him why, what was all this about going on, he said, if you want to know, talk to this guy. Go to this site, talk to this guy, because he's the only one I've ever told. So she did. And I had warned her that it would be pretty tough. Occasionally people contact me and ask me to take it down, which I do. And there's another maybe 100 to put up.
And that, it seems, is what will keep this story burning, even though Robert Gumpert, with his fascinating study, his remarkable stories, his insatiable interest in photographing people and listening to their words behind bars, can't be there in person doing it right now. But I think the last word in this story should come in the form of, as Robert calls it, radio with pictures. From the 19th of January, just about 3 years ago, Daniel Medina called to talk to Robert in the interview room. He brings with him a poem.
This is a poem, a song, I guess, that I wrote for my son called My Savior. I wrote it last year, just before I was released from a rehab I was in, and it kind of told my story up to that point. And so I'm going to share it with you here today, because I still feel it. I feel it the same way in my heart right now. It's called My Savior. Oh, my son's name is Dylan. He just turned 2 years old in October. It's called My Savior. When you were born, my voice caused a hush. I held you and thought I couldn't love anyone so much. They told me you may hurt from the feel of my touch. You were born opiate dependent, man, that's such an injustice. Brought on by your mom and your dad, who couldn't think enough to just drop the bag, preventing the anguish that I know you had. Seeing you tremble in the nursery always made me sad, so I'd flee to any temporary haven I could find, just to pull out my drugs and escape my mind, cause I felt like I failed for the 100th time, consciously knowing when you left you wouldn't be mine, but my mother's. And I used that to justify my deeds as I continued to run in your time of need, abandoning my first and only seed. And all these feelings inside led me to proceed to inject massive doses of suicide, self-sabotage angrily to mask my feelings that I'd hide, until a day came, right and wrong ceased to collide, and I got up, walked out, put all my BS aside. I gained clarity, and as my heart raced, I knew I must self-sacrifice, so you wouldn't grow up like me with no father in your life. And I'll be there to teach you to endure any strife, and I'll stand by proud as you choose a lady as a wife. That's success. Knowing I broke away from what had me enslaved, knowing you'll be okay from the lessons I gave, and on the day that I'm buried, I'll be at peace in my grave. My last words will be etched up under my name. You're my savior. That's it.
And that is it for today. My thanks to Robert Gumpert again, and by extension those who shared their stories with him and us as they waited in county jail for sentencing. Well, Friday we're back, of course, this time microphone in hand, making our Friday photo walk together, just the two of us, both with cameras, passing time, reading from the mailbag about what you've been doing with your photography of late, and some feedback on the shows too. So if you have anything you'd like to share from the programmes you've heard of late, write to me please at studio@photographydaily.show. That's the email address, studio@photographydaily.show. And of course, you can share 2,000 pixels wide, please, your photo walk pictures for inclusion on the show page. Talking of which, today's links to Robert and the photographs of those featured is on the show page, which you will find as a link on your podcast player app. If you can, and you feel so inclined, would you mind leaving a review on the podcast player app? If yours has a way of leaving one, it really, really helps with getting the show to a larger audience who may appreciate the stories told by photographers of all genres. Tomorrow, for patrons, well, I want to talk about what happens when your photographic mojo is not burning bright, or you're just not feeling it. Maybe we look around us and think, what is there to make pictures of today? But that'll be over on the members-only Patreon channel, which you can link to through the website too, photographydaily.show. Music in the show from artlist.io, and I look forward to photographing with you, hearing from you, and talking with you on Friday.
Photography Daily is a Loading Zone production.